So there's a chapter that goes into fish, and I won't go too much into that, but just to say this is huge. I mean, what we're doing to animals, the animals of the ocean and waters for food, are you familiar with this, what's happening? I mean, I won't go into it too much, but just basically the oceans are being completely devastated because the demand for fish is basically infinite now, because not only are we feeding, well, two things. One is when the new kinds of fishing they do are with these gigantic nets that just basically bring up everything. They have bottom trawlers that have huge wheels as larger than school buses that just roll and crush everything, and they bring up everything. About half of what they bring up is useless, so they just throw it back dead. The half that they can use is used, for human, but the demand is so great because fish are used to feed livestock. Most people don't realize, for example, that cows in the United States eat more fish than human beings do. They've discovered that cows will give a lot more milk, because how do you make a cow, instead of giving about 20 pounds of milk a day, give over 100 pounds of milk a day? You've got to give them hormones, and you've got to make them eat meat, because when they eat meat, they get a lot more milk. So cows are eating huge amounts of fish, as well as and then they feed the fish to pigs and to chickens, and then they feed the fish to other fish. For example, factory farm salmon now, it takes between 3 and 5 pounds of salmon to make, of wild-caught fish to make 1 pound of salmon. And now tuna fish are actually being factory farmed. These are magnificent fish that can swim 55 miles an hour, and they're in cages, and they're feeding them fish. And very often they feed, not only do they feed these fish to mammals and birds, but then they feed the birds and mammals back to the fish, and they're feeding these animals back and forth to each other in all kinds of ways. Like in Mississippi, for example, most of the grain in Mississippi is grown to feed these gigantic catfish farms that they have, and then they feed the catfish either to other fish, like salmon, or to cows and chickens, or to people, or whatever. Then they feed, and so there's a huge demand for fish, basically because to fatten up livestock and to feed other fish, because the oceans are being completely, tuna and swordfish and other, they're basically on the brink of extinction. So they're starting to factory farm them. So it's really important, and I've seen myself factory farm fish operations quite a bit, both inside, like inside these stinking sheds, they have these big swimming pools, or outside. But I'll just tell you, looking into one of these things, it's just, I was just looking into I thought it was empty. It was just black water, and I thought there was nothing in there. And then I kept looking, and I realized eventually that it was absolutely packed with fish, and they were swimming in their own feces, and that's why it was black, because they were just packed in so many fish, and they were, being given drugs and chemicals, and the workers were taking them out eventually and killing them, and people were eating them thinking they're getting something really good, really healthy omega-3s, and people don't realize that there's so many toxins that concentrate in these animals. So anyway, there's a chapter on fish. There's a chapter that I think is very important. I just want to touch on briefly here because I think it's so essential. It's called The Domination of the Feminine. And I think, one of the things that has been referred to, I talk about something called Sophia, which is the feminine wisdom within all of us. And I think, essentially, in order for us to eat the kind of food we're eating, we've had to learn to repress Sophia. The ancient Greek goddess of wisdom was Sophia. And this inner wisdom, I think, that we all have in our heart, that's always shining, is repressed. It had to be repressed because we could not do what we're doing. I think, for example, we know that if there's anything at all in nature that we should really honor and respect and just allow to happen, it's mothers giving birth to their babies and nursing those babies and nesting with those babies and protecting those babies. That this is something we should not mess with. And traditionally, nobody messed with that. But once we started owning animals for food, this was the very thing that they had to mess with the most, because they started, you had to get more babies, you want to make more, and so this is really the core violence. And I think Sophia was always profoundly uncomfortable with the rape of females and the stealing of the babies and then raping again. And I think, like modern factory farms would never be possible without science being able to completely control and dominate the estrous cycles of female birds and mammals. That's basically what allows this whole thing to work. And so men have completely controlled and dominated the feminine dimension. And I think we know that this feminine dimension is this wisdom and compassion that cares for life, that we've had to repress that, and that is what allows us to be destroying the oceans and just not worry about it, cutting down rainforests. When we go and cut down some trees to grow some soybeans to feed to pigs, chickens, or fish, we're not just cutting down some trees, we're destroying whole communities of life. Forests are not just trees, they're communities, and we go in and we just devastate this. I mean, how does Sophia feel about that? But again, Sophia is repressed when we're eating dairy products, when we're eating eggs, when we're eating meat. The female animals are so dominated. And in fact, I talk about this just briefly. I'll just tell you, some of you may already know this, but how do you get a cow to give so much milk? It takes a lot of meat, a lot of hormones, and these cows are worn out by the time they're only 4 or 5 years old and they're killed, and so there's this continual violence towards female animals, even on organic dairies. I saw it myself when I was a youngster, and I think it's this ongoing violence towards the feminine, the female animals, even on pig operations, on any of these operations, it's the female animals, essentially, that are most confined and most harmed. So it's important, I think, to understand how our disconnectedness with the feminine dimension can play such a big role in our inability to actually come to terms with what we're doing. And what I see happening, actually, is a resurrection of Sophia. This inner feminine wisdom is rising up. More and more people are beginning to say, I'm not going to eat animal foods. I am going to care about the earth and the environment and do something to change themselves. I'd love to change everybody else, but I think where we have to start is changing ourselves and bring our own actions into alignment with our values. And I think the more deeply we do that, the more powerful our actions and words will be in influencing others, in a positive way, because we'll be living it. So anyway, so it's a chapter. I'll just kind of wrap this up. There's a chapter that goes into the metaphysics of food, which is, I think, very interesting, because we know that physical toxins concentrate in animal flesh. I talked about that quite a bit in the World Peace Diet, because I think it's important to understand how this happens, that these animals are fed a lot of grains and other plant-based foods, but they're also fed the flesh of other animals, roadkill, dogs and cats, and manure, and all these things, so to fatten up the animals. And so there's a lot of toxins, but there's also metaphysical toxins. I think we're eating terror and fear and pain and depression and anxiety. Those are real experiences that these animals go through. And I think we live in a materialistic culture that pretends that there's no such thing as anything metaphysical. But I think, honestly, we begin to, as we again begin to mature spiritually, we begin to realize that there's a lot more, perhaps, to this than just the physical level, and that there's a reality to the violence that we're causing, and that we're, in India, for example, and actually in traditions in general, there's a whole understanding that the way that our attitudes and the energy, in a sense, that we carry really affect others. And it affects, like in the Zen monasteries, they say it's only the most, the monks with the best practice that can prepare the food. Anyway, and then there's a chapter about work, which is basically about how what we're doing to animals for food is not just hard on women, it's also really hard on men. That as men, we've learned early on to disconnect from the more gentle, tender, kind, merciful dimension of ourselves in our culture. We've had to compete. And the old Sanskrit word for war, the very first word for war was the desire for more cows. This whole thing of expanding and creating a culture based on war is basically founded on eating meat. So, and then the last few chapters of the book go into what I'd like to basically close here with, the ideas that this understanding is enormously liberating, because once we begin to see this, we realize that we're not some kind of flawed species that's condemned to ever more vicious cycles of violence until we finally exterminate ourselves. Basically, we have inherited an obsolete mentality of a food mentality. For whatever reason, those people 10,000 years ago thought they needed to herd animals and confine them and started this warrior culture and so forth. We don't have to criticize them. We just have to understand that today it's not necessary anymore. It's not appropriate. There's none of us that needs to eat meat, dairy products, or eggs to be healthy. In fact, all of the research shows, and it's enormously powerful, that the closer we come to a plant-based diet, actually the healthier we'll probably be. And not only physically healthy. See, the thing I think that's really interesting is that there's these 5 dimensions of health. And we have physical health, which is really fabulous. I mean, to be physically healthy and energetic. But that doesn't do a whole lot of good if we don't have, and that's dependent on also the other 4 levels of health, which are psychological health. In other words, I can be physically healthy, but if I'm psychologically sick, and stressed out or diseased. And remember what Krishnamurti said. He said, it's not a good idea to be well-adjusted to a sick society. So the whole idea is we want to be well-adjusted. We want to fit in. We want to go along with everybody else is doing. We want to eat what they're eating at the company picnic or what they're eating at the church fish fry. We want to go along. We don't want to be different. But the idea is if we don't understand this, then we end up having the same psychological problems. There's also cultural health. We don't want to live in a sick culture. So there's psychological health, cultural health, and then there's also spiritual health, that I've been talking about a lot here, and then there's also environmental health. How important it is for us to live in a healthy environment if we want to be healthy. If we're eating and drinking and breathing polluted air, water, and so forth, then it really affects us. So the understanding, essentially here, is that as we understand this more deeply, we can bring our behavior more into alignment with our understanding, and as we bring our behavior into alignment with our understanding, we begin to be a force for the evolution of our culture. And I think there's nothing more ennobling and more happiness-producing, really, at a deep level, than to be just living our life as best we can to fulfill something that helps the world in some way, to find our way to do that, to find our unique way of bringing a blessing to the world. And I think each one of us has something to contribute to this. And I think as each one of us brings what we have to contribute, it automatically encourages others to do the same thing. And together we begin to build a field of energy, of understanding, of commitment, of awareness, and passion for the truth that we are, to discover the truth that we are. What are we actually as human beings? Are we really essentially carnivorous? Are we really essentially warlike and predatory? Are we really predisposed to having heart disease by the time we're 60 years old and so forth? I think the joy that essentially is bubbling up inside all of us at the core of our being when we begin to understand the truth that we are is based on essential sense that we're interconnected not only with each other, but that we're part of an incredible, benevolent source of all life.